What if you have never truly been separate from the power you've been praying to? You say, with God all things are possible, and you believe it. That is why you are here. That is why you listen, why you search, why something in you keeps returning to this idea that there must be more. But notice what quietly happens next. You stop there. You leave God in one place and yourself in another. You believe in the power, but you do not identify with it. And that separation is the only thing standing between you and what you desire. Because the moment you accept that God is something outside of you, you also accept that creation is not yours, that power is not yours. That possibility belongs to something you must reach, convince, or wait for. But what if that entire structure is built on a misunderstanding? What if the statement was never meant to separate, but to reveal identity? Because the text does not say that God visits man. It says the Word became flesh and dwelt within. Not around you, not above you, within you. And that changes everything. Because now the creative power of the universe is no longer distant. It is not something you access. It is something you are expressing whether you realize it or not. And if that is true, then the question is no longer, is it possible? The question becomes, what are you doing with it? Because if this power is within you, then it must be operating through you. And if it is operating through you, then everything you experience must somehow be connected to how you are using it. Not occasionally, not symbolically, continuously. So now something becomes unavoidable. This word, this creative force, must have a form. It must have a function, and it must be accessible. And here is where everything becomes extremely direct. That power is your own imagination. Not imagination as fantasy. Not imagination as escape. But imagination as creation. Because before anything exists externally, it is imagined. Every object, every system, every structure, every achievement, all of it existed first as an imaginal act. That is not philosophy. That is observation. So if imagination is the beginning of all things, and if that imagination is within you, then what are you? Not as a concept, but as a function. Because if imagination creates reality, and you imagine, then you are not merely observing life. You are participating in its creation. And not passively, actively. So again, quietly. Are you treating your imagination as something trivial, or as the source of everything you experience? Because that distinction changes how you live. If it is trivial, you ignore it. If it is the source, you become aware of it. And awareness changes everything. Because now, you cannot casually entertain thoughts. You cannot dwell in states without consequence. You cannot assume things about yourself and your world and expect them to remain internal. Because they do not remain internal. They express, they organize, they externalize. So when you say I am, you are not making a statement. You are defining a state. And that state becomes your reality. Because I am is not just language. It is identity. And identity is creation. So if you say I am struggling, you are not describing your life. You are sustaining it. If you say I am not there yet, you are not being honest. You are being consistent with a state that keeps you there. And this is where everything becomes uncomfortable but precise. Because now there is no one to blame. Not circumstances, not people, not timing. Because if imagination is the creative power, and it is within you, then everything you experience must be connected to what you are imagining, consciously or unconsciously. And that realization is not meant to burden you. It is meant to free you. Because if you are the cause, you can choose differently. Not by force, not by effort, but by assumption. So now the question becomes very simple. Can you assume that you are already what you desire to be, even if everything denies it? Because that is the doorway. Not wishing, not hoping, not waiting, assuming and remaining Because if you can assume it and dwell in it, you will resurrect it. You will bring it into form, not because you forced it, but because you remained in the state long enough for it to express itself. So the process is not complicated. It is exact. You select a state, you enter it, you feel it as real, and you remain. Because remaining is what makes it real. And the only reason it does not stay is because you leave. So now that something has been made clear, that imagination is not fantasy but creation, the question is no longer whether it works. The question is whether you are using it deliberately or unconsciously, because you are using it either way. You cannot stop imagining. You can only decide what you are imagining from. And this is where the real work begins, not in doing more, but in becoming precise. Because most people imagine, but they do not enter. They see an image, but they do not dwell in it. They think of a possibility, but they do not become it. And that difference is everything. Because imagining is not about seeing something. It is about being in it. And being in it means something very specific. It means you have crossed a line internally, where what you're imagining is no longer something you're observing, but something you are experiencing. Even if the world has not changed, you have. And that change is the cause. So now the instruction becomes very direct. If it were true, how would you feel? Not what would you do, not how would it happen, but how would it feel right now if it were already real? Because that feeling is the state, and the state is what creates. So instead of asking, how do I get this? You begin asking, what would it feel like to already be this? And then you enter it quietly, internally, without announcement, without force, because forcing breaks the state, and thinking about it keeps you outside of it. You must step into it. And this is where something subtle but powerful is introduced. You do not imagine the thing directly. You imagine its reflection. You imagine how others would see you if it were already true. You imagine their faces, their reactions, their tone, their response. Not because they are the source, but because they reflect your state back to you. So if you assume you are successful, how would your friend look at you? Would they congratulate you? Would they smile differently? Would they speak to you with a new tone? Then see that, hear that, feel that. And in doing so, you are no longer trying to believe something. You are experiencing it. And experience convinces. Not logic, not repetition of words. The experience. Because once you feel something is real, the mind stops arguing. It accepts. And what it accepts becomes natural. And what is natural becomes your state. So again, quietly, are you imagining something or are you entering it? Because imagining from the outside creates distance. Entering removes it. And distance is the only reason things feel delayed. Not time, distance. So if you keep imagining something as over there, it will remain there. But if you bring it here, into your present awareness, into your feeling, into your identity, the gap collapses. Internally first, and then externally. So the process becomes very precise. You do not wait for evidence. You do not look for signs. You do not ask whether it is working. You assume, and then you remain, not rigidly, not perfectly, but consistently, because consistency is what gives it life. Consistency is what allows it to take form. And this is why the instruction is always the same. Dwell in the end, not in the process, not in the transition, not in the almost, in the end, because the end contains the feeling, the identity, the state. And once you are in the end, everything else rearranges itself to match it. Not because you control the world, but because the world reflects you. So if you remain in the state of being, the one who already has it, already is it, already lives it, something begins to move. Quietly. unseen, but precisely a series of events, a bridge, not planned by you, not forced by you, but formed from your assumption. And you will walk it naturally, without knowing you are walking it, until one day what you assumed appears. And the world calls it coincidence, or luck, or timing. But you will know it began the moment you entered the state and remained. And then something else becomes impossible to ignore, not about imagination itself, but about what you allow into it. Because if imagination is the creative power, then what you feed it matters. Not occasionally, not symbolically, but constantly. Because you're always feeding it through what you read, through what you react to, through what you dwell on when no one is watching. And this is where most people unknowingly undo everything they are trying to build. They imagine a desired state for a moment and then spend the rest of their day feeding the opposite. They entertain doubt. They absorb fear. They rehearse problems. They identify with limitation. And then they wonder why nothing changes. But nothing is wrong. They are simply being consistent with the wrong state, because imagination does not discriminate. It does not choose for you. It simply takes what you give it and expresses it, whether you intend it or not. So if you spend your time dwelling on what you do not want, you are not protecting yourself. You are creating. If you continuously react to negative impressions, you are not being realistic. You are being consistent. And consistency is what makes things real. So now something becomes very clear. You cannot afford to be careless with your inner world. Not in a fearful way, but in an aware way, because every impression becomes material. Every assumption becomes form. So again, quietly, what are you feeding your imagination when you are not paying attention? Because that is what is shaping your life. Not the moments when you try, but the moments when you default, and your default reveals your state. So the work is no longer just about imagining something new. It is about refusing to dwell in what contradicts it. Not by fighting it, not by suppressing it, but by withdrawing from it, gently, consistently, without drama. Because the moment you stop feeding a state, it begins to weaken. And the moment you return to another, it begins to strengthen. And this is where discipline becomes different. It is not force. It is not control. It is selection. Choosing what you allow to take root within you and what you do not. Because whatever takes root grows. And whatever grows expresses. So if you read something negative, you do not need to fight it. You do not need to react to it. You simply do not dwell in it. You do not carry it forward. You do not let it become your internal conversation. Because if you do, it becomes yours. And once it becomes yours, it must express. So the process becomes very clean. You choose a state. You enter it. You return to it. And you protect it, not by force, but by not feeding what opposes it. Because imagination is always active, always receiving, always creating, and you are the one directing it, whether you realize it or not. So now everything becomes even more precise. You are not reacting to the world. You are selecting what becomes your reality. And selection happens internally, quietly, moment by moment. So if you want something to change, you do not need to control the world. You need to become aware of what you are continuously accepting as true. And once you change that, everything else follows. Not immediately, but inevitably. Because what you persist in imagining must become real. And once you begin to hold a state, something else begins to move quietly behind the surface of things. Not visible at first, not dramatic, not something you can point to and say, there it is, but it is there, a rearrangement, a sequence, a pattern of events that begins to form without your effort. And this is where many misunderstand the process, because they expect to see the result immediately instead of recognizing the movement that leads to it. But the movement is essential, because what you assume does not appear out of nowhere. It unfolds through what could be called a bridge. A series of events, conversations, coincidences, opportunities that lead you from where you are to what you have assumed. Not randomly, not accidentally, but precisely aligned with your state. And the important thing is this: you do not build a bridge, you walk it. Because the moment you assume the end and remain in it, the bridge begins to form on its own. You are not responsible for how it happens. You are not required to figure out the steps. In fact, the moment you try to control the steps, you interfere with the process. Because control belongs to the mind that still believes it is separate. But if you are the source, then the unfolding must come from you, not from your effort. So again, quietly, are you trying to figure it out, or are you remaining in it? Because figuring out comes from doubt. Remaining comes from knowing. And knowing does not need to see the path. It trusts that the path is already forming. So what happens next often feels strange. Events begin to occur that seem unrelated. You may be moved to take an action you did not plan. Someone may appear unexpectedly. A situation may shift in a way that seems inconvenient or even negative. And this is where most people leave the state, because they judge the bridge instead of walking it. They see something they do not like and they react. They lose the feeling. They return to the old identity. And in doing so, they disconnect from the process that was already unfolding. So the key becomes very clear. Do not judge the bridge, because the bridge is not the end. It is the path, and the path may not look like what you expected. In fact, it rarely does, because it is not designed to satisfy your logic. It is designed to fulfill your assumption, and those are not the same thing. So if something happens that seems wrong, pause. Do not react immediately. Return to the state, because what you are experiencing may be necessary, not as punishment, but as movement. Movement toward the end you've already assumed. And this is where trust becomes real, not as an idea, but as a practice. The willingness to remain even when the middle looks uncertain. The willingness to stay aligned even when the world appears to contradict you. Because the world is not showing you what you are becoming. It is showing you what you have been. And if you react to it, you return to it. But if you remain in your chosen state, you move beyond it. So now, the process becomes very refined. You assume the end. You remain in it. You allow the bridge to form, and you walk it without losing yourself. Because losing yourself is the only thing that delays it. Not time, not circumstance, not other people, only your state. So if you can remain, even when things shift, even when events seem uncertain, even when the path is unclear, something inevitable happens. The bridge completes itself, and you arrive, not by force, not by chance, but by being consistent. And when you look back, it will all make sense. Not before, but after. And if you think this is only theory, something abstract, something poetic, then you have not yet seen how precise it can become when it is lived. Because there comes a point where imagination is no longer something you experiment with, it becomes something you rely on. Not occasionally, not when you feel inspired, but daily, consistently, almost quietly, as a way of being. And this is where the difference, because understanding can remain intellectual. Application becomes reality. There was a moment, simple, almost insignificant on the surface, where someone looked at something they did not yet own something that logically was out of reach, something that belonged to another. And instead of accepting what was seen, they replaced it internally, not forcefully, not desperately, but persistently. They saw their own name where another name stood. They repeated it, not once, not occasionally, but daily, morning and night, without evidence, without support, without permission. And this is where something important must be understood. They were not trying to get it. They were becoming the one who already had it. Because if they were still trying, they would have stopped. They would have questioned. They would have doubted. But they did not. They remained. And remaining is what gave it life. So day after day, nothing changed on the surface. The building was still owned by someone else. The circumstances were unchanged. The facts did not support the assumption. And yet, internally, the state was held quietly, consistently, without interruption. And then something happened. Not because they forced it, not because they planned it, but because the bridge formed. An opportunity appeared, a connection, a situation that could not have been predicted. A person entered the scene offering what logic would have said was impossible. And step by step, without strain, without struggle, the imagined state began to take form. And eventually, it became fact. Not symbolically, literally. And when it did, the world looked at the events and tried to explain them. They pointed to timing, to connections, to decisions, to actions. They tried to reconstruct the path as if the path were the cause. But it was not. The cause was invisible. The cause was internal. The cause was the state that had been assumed and sustained. And this is where everything becomes undeniable. Imagination is not playing. It is producing. So again, quietly. What are you consistently seeing when no one else can see it? Because that is what you are building. Not what you say once. Not what you try occasionally. But what you return to daily. Because daily repetition is not about convincing yourself. It is about stabilizing identity. And once identity stabilizes, reality has no choice. It must conform. So the question is no longer, can this work? The question becomes, are you willing to remain without evidence? Because evidence comes after, never before. And if you require evidence first, you will never remain long enough to produce it. So the process becomes very exact. You decide what you want. You imagine it as already true. You feel it as real. And you return to it daily. Not with effort, not with strain, but with quiet persistence. Because persistence is not force. It is loyalty to a state. And that loyalty is what transforms imagination into reality. So if nothing changes tomorrow, remain. If nothing changes next week, remain. If everything seems the same, remain. Because the moment you leave, you interrupt. And the moment you remain, you continue. And continuation is what completes the process. So now, everything is in your hands. Not through action, but through assumption. Not through control, but through consistency. Because what you consistently imagine, you inevitably become. And what you become inevitably appears. And as this understanding deepens, something even more radical begins to emerge. Not about what you can have, but about what reality actually is. Because up to now, you may still be holding on to a subtle assumption that the world exists independently, and you're simply influencing it. But what if that is not true at all? What if the world is not something you influence, but something you project? Because if imagination is the only creative power, and it is within you, then what you call the world must be the result of that activity. Not separate from it, not reacting independently, but expressing it. And this is where the statement becomes unavoidable. The world is you pushed out. Not metaphorically, literally, in experience. Because everything you encounter reflects a state within you. Not always the state you consciously choose, but the state you consistently occupy. And this is why two people can experience the same situation differently. Not because the situation changes, but because their state does. So now something shifts again. You are no longer trying to change events. You are no longer trying to control outcomes. You are no longer trying to fix what you see. You are beginning to understand that what you see is the result. And if it is the result, it cannot be the cause. So trying to change it directly is like trying to change a reflection without touching the mirror. It cannot work. And this is where most effort is wasted, because people try to change the reflection instead of changing the source. So again, quietly, are you reacting to what appears, or are you aware of what is producing it? Because reaction keeps you inside the same pattern. Awareness gives you access to the cause, and the cause is always within. So if something appears in your world that you do not like, the answer is not to fight it, not to resist it, not to analyze it endlessly. The answer is to recognize it as a reflection of a state, and then change the state, not outwardly, internally, quietly, completely. Because the moment the state changes, the reflection must follow, not instantly in form, but inevitably in direction. And this is where something becomes both powerful and uncomfortable. Because now there is no external blame, not truly. Because if everything is connected to your state, then everything you experience has passed through you, not consciously, but consistently. And that realization can feel heavy until you see what it really means. It means you are not powerless. It means you are not at the mercy of circumstances. It means nothing is fixed. Because if the source is within you and you can change the source, then everything can change. Not by force, but by assumption. So now the entire process becomes even simpler. You do not fix the world. You select a new state. You enter it. You remain. And you allow the reflection to adjust. Because it must. It has no choice. So if you assume yourself to be valued, the world must reflect that value. If you assume yourself to be secure, the world must organize itself around that security. If you assume yourself to be successful, the world must present you with success. Not because it rewards you, but because it reflects you. So the question is no longer, why is this happening? The question becomes, what am I being that produces this? And once you answer that honestly, you gain access to the only place where change is possible. Not outside, within. And from that point, everything becomes intentional. Not forced, but directed. Because now you know where creation happens. And you are no longer guessing. And when this becomes clear, not just understood, but accepted, something else begins to stabilize. Not as an idea, but as identity. Because up to now, you may still be treating this as something you use rather than something you are. You imagine, you return, you try to remain, but somewhere beneath it all, there is still the feeling that you are separate from the power. And that is the final illusion. Because the moment you truly see that imagination is not something you possess, but something you are, everything changes. Not gradually, fundamentally. Because now, there is no distance between you and creation. There is no gap between what you assume and what becomes. There is no external authority you must appeal to. There is only you, being. And that being is cause. So now the question becomes even more direct. Are you still trying to use imagination, or are you beginning to identify as it? Because using implies separation. Being removes it. And once that separation is gone, something settles. A quiet authority. Not loud, not expressive, not something you need to show, but something you know. A recognition that what you assume is not a request. It is a decision, and that decision carries creative power. So when you say I am, you are no longer hoping. You are defining, and definition is creation. Because I am does not describe, it establishes. So if you say I am uncertain, you establish uncertainty. If you say I am not there yet, you establish delay. If you say I am already that, you establish fulfillment. And reality has no choice but to follow. Not because it listens to you, but because it is you, expressed. So again, quietly, what are you declaring every day without realizing it? Because your life is not shaped by what you occasionally think. It is shaped by what you consistently accept as true. And acceptance is identity. So the shift now is no longer about trying to think better thoughts. It is about choosing a new self, a new I am, and then remaining there, not forcing it, not proving it, not defending it, but resting in it, because the moment it feels natural, it is yours. And when it is yours, it expresses without effort, without resistance, without delay. So if you assume you are confident, do not wait to feel confident. Be the one who already is. If you assume you are successful, do not look for signs. Remain as the one who already has. If you assume you are valued, do not seek validation. Stand as the one who already knows. Because seeking contradicts being, and contradiction delays expression. So the work becomes even simpler now. Choose who you are, assuming it. Remain in it, and do not return. Because returning is the only thing that breaks the state. Not doubt, not circumstances, not time, only your identification. So if you remain, even quietly, even imperfectly, something stabilizes. And when it stabilizes, it becomes effortless. And when it becomes effortless, it becomes you. And when it becomes you, it becomes everything. Because there is no separation. There never was. Only a misunderstanding of identity. And now that misunderstanding is ending. And then something almost imperceptible happens. Not an explosion, not a breakthrough in the way you imagine, but a quiet collapse of everything that once felt complicated. Because the moment you stop trying to become and finally remain, the entire structure of effort begins to dissolve. You are no longer chasing states. You are no longer trying to hold feelings. You are no longer checking reality. Because there's nothing left to confirm. You are already there. And this is the point most people never reach. Not because it is difficult, but because it is too simple. It does not feel like achievement. It feels like recognition. As if something you have always known, but never trusted, is finally allowed to stand on its own. Because the truth was never hidden. It was only ignored by habit. The habit of looking outward. The habit of reacting. The habit of separating yourself from the source. But now that habit is weakening. And what replaces it is awareness. Not awareness of techniques, not awareness of methods, but awareness of being. And being does not require maintenance. It requires acceptance. So now everything reduces to one movement. Not imagining to get, but imagining from not feeling to change, but feeling because it is already true. Not waiting for reality, but allowing it to reflect you. And once this becomes natural, something irreversible takes place. You stop thinking of imagination as a tool. You stop thinking of states as something you enter and leave. You stop thinking of reality as something separate, because there is no longer a gap. And where there is no gap, there is no delay. Because delay only exists when there is distance. And distance only exists when there is separation. But you are no longer separate. So now, quietly, if everything you desire were already true, what would remain? Not what would you do, not what would you change, but what would remain. And the answer is simple. You, as you are, when nothing is missing. And that version of you is not in the future. It is a state available now. So the final step is not to reach it. It is to stop leaving it, because you've already touched it. You have already felt it. You have already recognized it. The only thing left is to remain. And when you remain without forcing, without questioning, without returning to old identities, something becomes stable. And when it becomes stable, it becomes natural. And when it becomes natural, it becomes reality. Not because you made it happen, but because you stopped interrupting it. So in the end, nothing was ever delayed. Nothing was ever outside of you. Nothing was ever missing. You were not trying to create reality. You were learning to stop leaving it. And when you finally stop, everything appears